at Chicago School, and they will be happy to take care of it. And now, back to Briggs.
All right, let's share the screen here. Can you see the presentation, hopefully?
Yes.
Okay,
Yes.
awesome.
Okay, here we go.
All right, so as Jeff just said, I am Dr. Brent Briggs. I am a licensed professional clinical counselor in the state of Kentucky. And throughout my career, I've had the benefit of working with various different populations, but one of the populations I kind of started working with earlier on in my career was juvenile sex offenders. And over the course of working with that population, one, it really was interesting to me. And then also through the process, I learned a lot of the poor treatment processes that were given for this population. And when I, started looking at research and trying to understand the population a little more, it was part of my goal to find a way to advocate for the population, as well as help the counseling profession grow in other ways with handling our way of treating and working with juvenile sex offenders. Part of the process for me, and one of the areas that I really wanted to understand, was how we as professional counselors kind of look at this population, whether we have bias towards them or not. As I mentioned earlier in my career, I worked with juvenile sex offenders and still do. But what I've realized here, especially here in the state of Kentucky, there's very limited treatment options. At one point, I was one of possibly 3 people who were certified in the state of Kentucky to work with juvenile sex offenders. So if you think about that, that's a huge population with not a lot of options when it comes to service. So I really felt that this was something that we needed to explore, we needed to understand better, and wanted to just figure out why there was no, such a limited opportunity when it comes to treatment for this population. So kind of jumping into a little bit, I briefly touched on some of this, but also within the importance for the profession as professional counselors, there's certain areas in our code of ethics that I think, really sometimes we forget about or don't pay as much attention to when it comes to treating special populations. And I think some of those are such as our own personal values or beliefs around things. And, sometimes there's discrimination, even though we may not even be aware that we're discriminating. I don't know how many times I've had conversations with people who were like, well, I don't want to work with that population, or I don't, that population scares me, or things like that. And then also there's a supervision aspect to it too, that if you're going to provide licensure supervision or any form of supervision to someone who's working with these populations, it's very important to understand that ultimately you're the gatekeeper and you're there to help make sure that the client is receiving the best quality of care that they can. So jumping into kind of the research and kind of a little bit of background information on the topic, and I'll be completely transparent, I'll talk about here in a little bit, is that there is very little research out there regarding the juvenile sex offender population. So much of it is so heavily focused on the adult population. So some of these articles and some of the research that has been done, it may seem a little dated, but that's because there's such a limited number of research articles out there. So again, most research focused on the adult population with very little consideration to the juvenile sex offender population. And I'm talking, when I say very little, we're talking about, barely even touching on proper treatment modalities for juvenile sex offenders. There was an increase in demand for community-based treatment settings for juvenile sex offenders because a lot of the thought process was to kind of incarcerate and rehabilitate as much as we do the adult population for most of our crimes in this country. And sexual offenders are viewed as needing punishment for their behaviors, not treated in a counseling dynamic. So in Kentucky, you see a lot of individuals who are put into DJJ services and are treated as if they were someone who had committed a crime. And some of the fact is that not every situation is that. I think about on some of the cases that I've worked with where you had individuals who were lower functioning and who were at a cognitive level who didn't really understand what they were doing, but then get charged for a crime and placed in these situations. Another thing that happens, and I thought quite frequently in the residential side of things, is that individuals who maybe aren't very aren't raised in an area that allows them the ability to actually be taught proper right from wrong, end up committing such sexual offenses or sexual acting out behaviors that therefore are treated as crimes and are placed in more of a punitive setting rather than a counseling kind of treatment program. As in many things in our society, everything is often driven by public opinion. I mean, we think about any of our laws, any of our regulations, any of the kind of rules that we have, they're all driven by somebody's perspective. So when it comes to the juvenile sex offending aspect of things, public opinion very much drives what we are, how we are handling this situation and how we are handling these individuals. So surveys have shown that many people believe they need protection from sexual offenders, including juveniles. So much as we see in our world, our society today, is that, like, you know, these are bad individuals. They can't be treated, you know, within the realm of what normal society expects. So the best thing to do is lock them away so we can protect, you know, the people who follow the rules. Again, as I mentioned, public opinion impacts the formation and implementation of policies within the United States. And negative public opinion has been a driving factor in management policies for adults, resulting in the same policies being implemented for juveniles without consideration for any long-term consequences. When doing my research and then also working with the population, there's very little consideration for individuals who are juveniles that take into consideration nature versus nurture. So we're treating these 11, 12-year-olds as individuals that are on the same level developmentally, intellectually, morally, whatever word you want to use, as an adult. And so in these situations, we are sometimes putting 11-year-old kids on a sex offender registry for the rest of their life. You know, and that is hard for me to understand because 10, 11, 12-year-olds aren't even developed in any way, shape, or form to be responsible for some of the consequences that we are giving them, such as being on a sex offender registry for the rest of their life. In 2005 was kind of when the difference between children and adults in the judicial process began to appear. And when I say a difference, it's very small difference, and most of it is that juveniles at that point then became to see a little bit more that, oh, treatment is maybe a good option, but who's going to treat them? And so there's a push for treatment programs, treatment facilities, but a lot of the treatment facilities and the treatment programs, especially here in Kentucky, were housed in DJJ. So even though we were trying to get some sort of treatment, we were still incarcerating some of these juveniles in a sense to hopefully rehabilitate them and for them to be better for society once they get out. But we're not taking into account putting 11, 12, 13, or whatever age individuals into a population that is sometimes there with kids who are murderers, kids who rob, you know, things like that, that are extreme behaviors that may not necessarily correlate with the behavior that that child is being adjudicated for in the court system. Following a summary of the literature review, as I said earlier, limited research on the juvenile sex offender population, current treatment programs or judicial means of treatment may not be effective, and counselors' experience with sex offending population can have a positive impact on their treatment of the individuals. And for me, I think this is important because, you know, as a counselor, as a professional, we really should approach the situation at an unbiased kind of approach to it, and ultimately thinking about how we can help make the other individual life better, or help them through whatever's going on. Because a lot of the situations that, especially on the juvenile side of things, is sometimes a product of their environment or what the situation is that they're being placed in. And if we don't help them process some of the traumas that they've gone through or some of the other things that they've experienced, then how are we really treating them? And then another thing that was, through the literature review, counselors' belief systems was impacted by their ability to treat clients in an ethical, non-judgmental way. So research showed that, our home belief systems are sometimes impactful on how we treat individuals. And I think that's fair. And I think we all have to admit that sometimes we do have biases, but I think it's also important that we also recognize where those biases are and work through them to become a better counselor. Successful treatment modalities do have a positive impact on perceptions of the sex offender population. So one of the things that came up a lot in through the research that when studies did try to implement treatment modalities or treatment practices, multisystemic therapy was really important. Family therapy was really important in showing how to have a positive impact on that individual. So the purpose of this study was kind of a need to understand the effects that professional counselors' belief systems or their level of spirituality have, and do they have an impact on attitudes towards juvenile sex offenders? So as I mentioned, I'm in Kentucky, so that's part of the Bible Belt. And so I think, living in a rural Kentucky and then also living in the city in some of the bigger cities of Kentucky as well, you get different cultural areas and different pockets on how everybody handles these types of behaviors, the sexually acting out behaviors in the juvenile sex offenders when they are adjudicated. So for me, it was interesting, and I wanted to kind of explore that, do our belief systems or spirituality have any kind of impact on the way that we respond to this population? And if so, how do we kind of address that? And I also wanted to kind of look at, the years of experience that a professional counselor has on their treatment of this population. My thought process is that, maybe a new counselor who's just fresh out of school is more apprehensive of working with this population. Maybe you don't really become comfortable with this population until later on, in your career, when maybe you've had more experience, more opportunities to kind of grow, learn, and things like that. So it was curious for me to want to try to figure out a little bit more about how years of experience as well as religion plays into this population. When creating this research study, the main assessment tools I used was the CATSO and the beliefs and values scale. The CATSO is a 18-item, 4-factor kind of simple questionnaire. All the factors I add together to establish a total score. Total scores range from 18 to 108. Higher scores represent more negative attitudes towards sex offenders, and lower scores represent more positive attitudes. The CATSO is one of the more popular instruments that are used to measure attitudes towards sex offenders. So the CATSO has been used in most research. Church et al. Has done a lot of research regarding sex offenders and actually created the CATSO for that specific purpose. And it's really shown the validity to be helpful in measuring what the overall attitude is of somebody regarding that. The beliefs and value scale was to provide standardized results of one's beliefs and values. Is a 20-item measure with the sum of total scores ranging from 0 to 80, 0 being low spiritual beliefs, 80 being high spiritual beliefs. Each question is a 5 possible response: strongly agree, neither agree or disagree, and strongly disagree. The beliefs and values scale was used because I didn't want to specifically focus on just religion, like a denomination of religions or anything like that, because sometimes we don't all, associate religion. Sometimes we have, religion and spirituality aren't necessarily a correlation all the time. So in that framework, I wanted to be able to, if you did believe in a higher power, believe in anything, outside of, yourself, like I wanted you to be able to be included in the study because I felt like that was also important in this process as well. So my research questions were, is there a significant positive relationship between spirituality and LPCs and the CATSO-R scores? Do years of experience positively and significantly predict CATSO-R scores? is there a significant positive relationship between spirituality and LPCs and their CATSO R scores? Does the variable of years experience moderate the relationship, where more years of experience will strengthen the relationship between beliefs and values and CATSO scores? So setting up the research and trying to find the best methodology approach, obviously I wanted to make sure that everybody who participated was an LPC. So there was a requirement that you had to have a master's level education and were licensed by your representative state. The criteria was strongly followed off of the state of Kentucky, just because that's where I live. So, you know, in Kentucky, you have to have a 60-hour college master's level course, graduate from a Crackerper University. So those were kind of the criteria looking for LPCs. The sampling framework followed an inclusion and exclusion criteria, and all participants were over the age of 18, had access to a computer, and completed all assessments as well as demographic information. Data collection was done through SurveyMonkey. It was decided that was probably the best way to collect information electronically, as participants were from all over the country. So it was worked out that way to get opinions from people, not just in Kentucky, but also various other locations within our the United States. And when completing the survey, particular demographic information was looked at: marital status, household income, religious denomination, sexual orientation, geographical location, and ethnicity. And then they were asked to complete the CATSO and the beliefs and values scale, and all data was analyzed using SPSS through multiple regression and hierarchical regression. I asked for religious denomination in my data collection, even though it was not necessarily used as a criteria in this, just because I wanted to have that information for later research to explore if maybe, you know, needed to have a more specific denomination rather than just being very broad with spirituality. So the study results, with this, there was 44 participants. 4 did not complete all the required areas of the study. If you didn't complete all the requirements of the study, then your results weren't included. Majority of the participants were white at 87.5%. Black and African American was at 5%, and Hispanic and Latino were at another 5%. Those were the largest racial categories that people identified with in this research. Most frequent years of experience for LPCs was 2 to 6 years at 40%, 6 to 10 years made up 27.5%, and the group with over 10 years of experience was 20%. The smallest group of participants was LPCs with 0 to 2 years of experience at 12.5%. I was really surprised to see that the 0 to 2 years was so low. I kind of expected that to be a little higher, but it was nice to see that, you know, getting a good range between the 2 and 10 year experience mark, I think really showed a little bit of the importance and understanding, like helping understand if that experience really does have an effect on one's beliefs or attitudes towards the population. Now, as I mentioned, I did look at the religious area in my demographic information, in which 75% observed with the category identified with the category Christian, which followed Protestant, Methodist, Lutheran, and Baptist. There was a nothing category comprised of 10% of the sample, and then Catholic represented 7.5%, and atheist agnostic represented another 5%. So the study results. I will say that I was a little sad with the results on this, just because I had lots of hopes that, you know, there would be some kind of wonderful, you know, discovery on my part. So, you know, is there a significant positive relationship between spirituality and LPCAs and CATSO scores? The results of the multiple regression conducted on the relationship between these two variables showed that there was not a significant level of variance. And then the beliefs and value scores accounted for less than 1% of the explained variable in the CATSO scores, which I think is even though I was a little disappointed because there wasn't like a huge variance in it, I think it's still very important to understand that like necessarily spirituality isn't affecting one's attitudes towards the juvenile sex offenders. So I think that's good information to have, and will help continue to build on the research for the juvenile sex offenders population, because then we can begin to explore what maybe there are other biases, or maybe there is, specific areas that we need to explore a little further, like I said earlier, rather than just the vague spirituality definition. The research question 2 was, do years of experience positively and significantly predict CATSA scores? Multiple regression for the research questions established that years of experience cannot statistically predict CATSA scores. Again, another not necessarily a great significant result in changing the world right there, but I think it is helpful in understanding that with this information, we now have a better understanding that years of experience don't necessarily reflect one's attitudes. And as I mentioned earlier, the significant portion of participants had between 2 and 10 years of experience, which is a very good range regarding one's beliefs towards the population. However, with there being such a low number from 0 to 2 years experience, maybe the results could have been a little different. Research question 3 was if there's significant positive relationship between spirituality and LPCs and their CATSA scores. Does the variable of years of experience moderate the relationship, where more years of experience will strengthen the relationship between beliefs and values and CATSA scores? So I couldn't run this statistical analysis because research question 1 and research question 2 were non-significant. So that basically threw out the research question 3 and just kind of didn't give us any information there. So jumping into kind of the discussion of findings, the purpose of this study was to explore the relationship between attitudes towards JSOs and spirituals and LPCA. There was a wide range in participation, as I mentioned, and the ages for individuals participating were 25 years to over 65 years. Approximately 50% were in the age range of 25 to 34 years old. I think that's a really good age range to have. I think because in many regards, we're looking at individuals who are more established in their careers, they're more understanding, and have more wisdom, things like that I think help us understand, or hopefully help us understand that we have a better self-identity in these situations. And as I mentioned, over 75% of the participants identify as having a religious affiliation, even though it appears the religious affiliation or spirituality had really no impact on overall attitudes. The data analysis showed that there was no significant related hypothesis for the study's RQ's research questions related to beliefs and values or years of experience when it came to CATSA scores. Analysis showed no relationship between years of experience as an LPC and attitudes toward JSOs. As a result, showed all participants had more positive attitudes toward the population, regardless of years of experience. Again, I think that's another point to point out, is that overall we're having a more positive attitude toward the population, which is wonderful. The problem is I don't see people lining up down the block to want to work with this population. So it's curious to see those results, but then also wonder where are the people who want to treat these individuals. As I mentioned, due to RQ1 and RQ2 not being significant, couldn't run RQ3. Limitations kind of to the study, as we see in most research studies. I have to believe that the participants may not have been truthful. It was a very small sample size and limited demographic participants. I mean, basically all of my participants were white and Protestant, ages ranged 25 to 34. So it didn't give me a huge demographic variable there that would help, understand if it's more maybe just white population and Protestant population are more open to working with those individuals. Instrument limitations. The CATSO-R was designed to measure attitudes towards adult sex offenders. I think this is important to note is that when this assessment was created, it was specifically designed to measure adult attitudes. Now, it has been used in other research to explore what individuals' attitudes are towards juveniles. However, there's not enough research out there to strongly validate that, oh, this is a great tool for juveniles as well as adults. The beliefs and value scale was designed to measure spirituality. Spirituality, as I mentioned, can be very subjective and hold different meanings for different people. So I had to believe that the beliefs and values would measure spirituality in a very, I guess, based on what my definition would be of spirituality. However, not taking into account that maybe not everybody's definition of spirituality is the same as mine. Implications. I kind of mentioned this a little earlier about some of the reasons why I think that this research is important and why I still think it's important. And going into it as like following the ACA Code of Ethics, results from the study could show that LPCAs are unbiased in their treatment of the JSO population, which is all that we really ask for as professional counselors. You know, when we follow our Code of Ethics, when we participate in therapy with our clients, you know, we really want to provide them an unbiased level of treatment. And working with the JSO population, it's a difficult population to work with. And sometimes it's hard to listen to some of the things that have happened and hear what the stories that these individuals have to tell and not feel biased. So seeing the results of this, as I mentioned, is that like, you know, that maybe with these results, it does show that we are not as biased as maybe I presumed, you know, the population would be. Also, no significant relationship between attitudes and years of experience or level of spirituality. It is possible that LPCAs in the study have a strong understanding of cultural implications in their therapeutic methods, as well as a firm foundation of their ethical standards when treating clients. Again, another positive that you could be taken away from this is that, you know, many of the participants in the study have been taught, you know, appropriately through their graduate programs or doctoral level programs, that being culturally aware, taking into consideration that, you know, every culture has its own process of handling things and dealing with things and learning through those things. And then also following our ethical standards that are set forth by the Code of Ethics, and how we treat our clients. The insignificant results in the study may underscore the importance of unbiased therapeutic relationship and treatment in treating the JSO population. So the therapeutic relationship is a reliable predictor of patient outcomes. So if we are building a strong relationship that follows the Code of Ethics, that follows cultural understanding, that follows, you know, all the various different ethical standards set forth by our boards and the profession and NBCC, all of that, then we are doing a good job in creating positive patient outcomes. Treatment effectiveness is influenced by the provider's attitudes and the therapeutic relationship. So if I have a positive attitude and I truly build a therapeutic relationship, then regardless of whatever treatment modality I'm using, it can be effective. And so I think that's important to note, is that you don't necessarily have to have this one specific treatment modality to work with this population. I go back to the very basic fundamentals of counseling and just having positive human regard, being able to communicate with your clients, understand where they're coming, validate, relate, and empathize and sympathize with them, helps to build those relationships where you can have a positive treatment effect. When a JSO believes there's a healthy therapeutic relationship, it is more likely that they will adhere to the treatment process. I would argue that that's probably not just for JSOs, I think it's for all of our clients, but I think it is very important because with the JSO population, you're dealing with a lot of individuals who come from broken backgrounds, who come from situations where there's little to no trust. They have no positive support system. They have sometimes no positive role models, whether it be male, female, or, you know, whatever their role model situation is. And I think being someone in that therapeutic role and building a healthy relationship can help model positive behavior and make some important changes. Considerations for future research. Exploring professional counselors' self-efficacy regarding the competency in working with JSOs and their opinions related to the treatment process for the populations. Research might be needed on a better method to measure individuals' attitudes toward juvenile sex offenders. As I mentioned earlier, there's no specific assessment specialty specifically for determining attitudes towards the JSO population. And I think that is very important to acknowledge and trying to figure out, is there a better way to establish an assessment or measure for specifically the juvenile sex offender population? Again, a lot of the research and a lot of the information we have relies heavily on adult offender population. So it's very hard, even though they may both be classified as sex offenders, they're two worlds, they're two different worlds. And I don't think it's fair to compare behaviors of one to the other one. And so I think that we as, professionals and through research have to find a better way to work with the juvenile sex offender population to gain appropriate understanding of how people feel about that population. Considering collecting more widespread data, as I mentioned, I did have participants from all over the country. However, it was very small population number, and then also it was very white Protestant. And I think that limits the ability of getting a better understanding of how people truly feel. And also it was limited to only people who had access to social media. And so when you're faced with those limitations, it's hard to really reach those individuals who aren't necessarily connected on social media or connected in a technology world anyway. And so I think by gaining more, widespread participants, it would help in creating a better understanding of like what the true professional counselor attitude is towards this population. And as mentioned earlier too, relationship between religiosity and attitude towards JSOs without incorporating spirituality. Religious attitudes and orientation may provide more specifics on the assessment process. Spirituality is such a very vague thing and one that is very subjective. And when you compare it to religion, each religion has its own set of guidelines that individuals adhere to. And so I think being able to look more specifically at certain religions, but not just, being more specific, not just Christianity, but looking more like, okay, specifically Protestant or specifically Baptist, Catholic, whatever it may be, to better understand, what that religion follows more so than, the spirituality aspect. Wow. Okay, I'm done. Sorry.
Dr. Brandt, Dr. Briggs,
yes.
I'm sorry. I've got a question or a comment here in the in the chat for you. I wonder how levels of orthodoxy in religion or spirituality might play a role. Like if someone identifies strongly with a more conservative or more reform religious practice, how would that impact their CATSO scores?
Yeah, I think that's a very good question. I'm trying to read the question too and process it. So hold on 1 second. I think that the CATSO in general was designed very, very simplistically. There was simple questions as, do you believe sex offenders can be rehabilitated? Oh, sorry, the question popped up. Yeah, so the questions on the CATSO were very, very like simplistic. So simple things such as, do you believe sex offenders can be rehabilitated? And it's on a Likert scale 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, strongly disagree, all that stuff. So I think the CATSO in many ways doesn't have a way to truly understand if somebody is being extremely conservative or is in more of a reform religious practice. But I think that's a very good, question. I think that's part of the future research aspect too, is that, religion as a whole and the general definition is that it is very subjective in many ways. There are specific religions out there that are more conservative, if you want to use that word, than other ones. And I think that, having that knowledge and being able to maybe look at, that information in comparison to a more conservative, religion, or maybe a more, liberal religion, I think would be helpful in understanding is that impactful. So I hope that answers the question. And I'm more of a answer questions kind of guy and have a good conversation about it. So if anybody has any questions or just any curiosity, I mean, feel free. As much as I like reading PowerPoints, I like to actually talk about it a little bit more.
I have a question.
Yes.
How do you think your research can be applied to trauma-informed practice?
Oh, giving me heavy hitters. Okay. No. So, when it comes to trauma-informed practice, I think that's really what the underlying issue is for me in many regards to this, is because when I think about the kids that I've worked with in foster care, in boys residential, you're dealing with kids who were removed in typical situations from their original care. So most of those kids are coming from a situation where they have experienced trauma in some regards, whether it be neglect, abuse, sexual abuse. I mean, the list goes on and on and on. And so I think that when we look at this from a counseling perspective, I think that's where we get lost, is because we don't consider the trauma aspect of things. I think we look at it and go, oh, this person did something horrible, therefore they're bad people. And that's the adult mentality. It's like, oh, well, an adult sex offender did this, so therefore, they're just bad and they can't be rehabilitated. Let's do chemical castration, which isn't actually off the table for some kids, by the way. So that to me is unfair, because I'll even argue on the adult side of things that sometimes adults are in the situation because they were victims themselves and they never learned any better. So I think, besides ranting, I'll try not to rant. Getting back to your original question and the fact of how does trauma and being trauma-informed care, I think that we have to be trauma-informed. I think we have to understand that these are kids, these are individuals who have experienced significant levels of abuse, neglect, malnutrition. I mean, I think of some of the things that I've heard, and I just it's amazing that some people survive. And in many regards, some of these individuals are victims themselves. And I think we lose that they're victims and we focus on their perpetrators. And I think that's a very derogatory term to use in some regards, because it isn't trauma-informed, nor does it truly address what the real issue is. Because if you actually look at the research that's done on juvenile sex offenders, the recidivism rate, if a kid gets treatment, is very low. So if they get treatment, it's less than 10% if they get treatment that they'll likely reoffend again. So if you take that into consideration, then why wouldn't you follow a treatment method? Why would you follow a punitive method that says, oh, you did this at 11 years old, now you're going to go to juvie till you're 18. Then once you're out of juvie at 18, best of luck to you, because now you're a registered sex offender, and good luck for the rest of your life. So I really hope that answers your question, because that's more of a soapbox than it is an answer of your question. But
No, it did. But it leads me to a follow-up question.
okay.
What future direction do you think you want to take this research in?
There's lots of paths, but I would think that the first thing I would really want to do is I would really like to explore more of a specific religion areas, rather than the very vague subjective spirituality thing. Part of doing the spirituality was just kind of the way things kind of worked out for the research purposes of this study. But for me personally, my goal has always been better to understand the religion aspect in more detail. Because as I mentioned, in Kentucky Bible Belt, there's no shortage of different religions. So the ability to have a better understanding of multiple different religions, multiple different conservative, non-conservative religions, I think is very important, because I also think about, from a cultural standpoint as well, building in with religion, is that if you go to small rural areas, not just in Kentucky, but other places in the world as well, the religious belief will sometimes be different than, say, you go to a big city of like New York or Chicago. So they both could be Baptist, but the fact is that the Eastern Kentucky or Appalachia Baptist is completely different than the Dallas, Texas Baptist. So it's wanting to understand that aspect as well is very important, in my opinion, and would be like to be where I go next, because I think once you understand the religion more specifically, it then will give you an opportunity to explore other areas. And I look at this research as more just kind of like the foundational building blocks. Because as I said, multiple times, there's such limited research. I mean, I think about the research I did on this is that, the first time we started looking at juvenile sex offenders was in 1982. So, that's not that long ago that we finally began to say, oh, well, maybe we should consider juvenile sex offenders as a population. And even in the 80s, that was still very much treat them as an adult. And then in the 90s, we kind of began to classify more so what juvenile sex offending was. So your voyeurism, your simple, the extreme sexual assaults, sodomy and, rape and, molestation, all those things, but still looking at, voyeurism still on there, and all those different things that we sometimes don't necessarily consider to be sex offending behaviors. We consider it to be, I don't want to say age appropriate behavior, but sometimes like that age group, prepubescent inappropriate behavior that we
like
didn't,
exploration behavior.
yes,
Yeah.
that we didn't quite consider sexually acting out behaviors until more recently. And so, as I mentioned earlier, you think about someone who maybe, have a cognitive impairment, or somebody who may be, experiencing, those different things, who aren't at a developmental level, who's 18, who operates, more like a 10-year-old level. Their behavior is going to mimic that age. And then we're going to sit there and say, oh, well, because you're 18, you're now going to be charged. So yes, to answer your question, religion is the area that I would like to truly go.
I have a quick question, just from the familiarity of this population as well, just because I was sharing earlier. I've always found, and it seems like almost 100%, and I'm not saying that it is, but have you found over the, throughout the research, that there is a high level of, where they're just repeating the trauma? Because that's what I've found, and I just didn't know if that was consistent with your experience.
Yeah, through research that I have found, it is, a lot of it is just repeating the what's been done to them.
Right.
Even like there's a few longevity studies out there, longitudinal studies out there that look at somebody who was brought in for treatment and follows them over the course of whatever. And most of the time, what led them to acting out was because somebody else perpetrated on them. Right. And not just looking at the research, but looking at it from a professional standpoint as well. A lot of the kids I worked with were in the exact same situation. I think about, 11-year-old kids that I worked with who was a perpetrator according to the court system, but he was forced by his parents. So, how is that? So much of this situation, and that's where I think I'll say my annoyance, I don't know if that's appropriate to use that word, but my annoyance with the system is that we're not considering those things. We're saying, oh, this kid did this, so they must be bad. No, this kid did what they did because since 6 years old, this has been happening, or whatever's been happening. And so, why would we not? We consider that stuff in every other aspect of mental health. Why would we not consider it in this? But yes, a lot of the research has shown that it is typically there is, repeating of behavior because it has been, done to them before. And even actually, not that I did this on adults, but actually a lot of the research on adults is the same way, is that they were victims themselves and they just reacted or did the same behavior because it was done to them. So,
I have a question.
yes.
I was wondering if you have noticed or if you've worked with kids that are actually in the foster care system and if they have the same success rates that you were talking about, if you intervene early enough, or if that is a factor that just completely knocks that off board because they are in the system. So that's an extra, complexity.
Yeah, I think that's a very good question. And unfortunately, there's no research on that at all. I think that would be a good area to explore. In my personal experience, I wouldn't say that it's less likely to be successful. Just because I think because when you're looking at a lot of the situations when it comes to the success rates of treatment, a lot of it is a support system around. So if a kid is in foster care who has a strong support system within the foster family or whatever, it can sometimes be effective. Now, unfortunately, as those who have worked in the foster care system or have any connection with that, kids get moved around so frequently it's hard to build a support system. So I wish I had a great answer for your question, and I don't. I think it's a really good question, and actually, something that I think should be considered down the road in this regards to this research, because, that's a whole nother area. Is that we're again goes back to Dr. Brown McCormick's question about trauma informed, right? Like the foster care system can sometimes be trauma, and if we don't take that into consideration as well, then how are we truly doing a positive? Sorry, I don't have the perfect answer.
No, that was great. I was actually thinking the same thing through this whole presentation, that I feel like it could be a curse or a blessing depending on the case.
Yeah. And again, like I've had positive outcomes in that situation. I've also had not positive outcomes in that situation. And so it's hard to statistically say, yeah, it's more effective. It's not. I think, it's just, like as with the system, it's sometimes about getting the kids connected to the right family and the right support system. I do know that in my process of working in foster care and residential, a lot of the times the DJJ or the court system would make sure that a kid was put into a home that had no other children. So that way, it limits the access, I guess, to perpetrate again. So, that was one of their kind of deterrents.
Thank you so much.
Any other questions? I appreciate the questions because you helped me get through some of this too. And I like to much talk about it in general. So.
Do you think that more states will eventually adopt this? You know how we have like I'm a substance abuse counselor, how we have like special different courts for different populations. Don't you think that this should be considered a special court opportunity for the court system? There just seems to be so many juveniles that fit under this category.
No, I think it would be great. The problem is that every state does everything differently. And that's like, nobody can come to agreement. Like there was a few years ago in Kentucky, that Kentucky had the bright idea to just release everybody from DJJ because they thought that it wasn't working. So, I don't understand some of the logic. And I agree with you. I think that being able to have a more balanced approach, such as, you know, in Kentucky, we have a lot of drug court programs. We have a lot of mental health court programs. So there's a lot of these programs that are set to help get people through treatment rather than punitive measures. But I don't see that as being a top priority in that world, just because, I mean, I don't know. I don't know what the logical reasoning is for it, because if research shows that treatment is effective, why wouldn't you follow that method? And I don't know if it comes down to politics. I don't know if it comes down to dollars. I don't know, you know, unfortunately, I don't get to know that information. But I agree. I think that there should be more of a holistic wraparound kind of care system through the courts, because sometimes in the court, it sometimes just depends on the judge you get, and that's a whole nother factor that you can't even control. And, you know, I think, not to, you know, I think Jeff mentioned he was from Florida, so I'm not gonna, you know, talk too bad about Florida, but, you know, they're one of the strictest places, you know, when it comes to that, you know, and then you've got other states that actually follow treatment. I mean, Kentucky at one point was doing a treatment method or a treatment modality. They had two programs. I say they were doing a treatment modality. They had two programs in the state of Kentucky, which they ended up shutting one, actually both of them down, I think now, because the money. So.
And just you're absolutely right. You know, it's such the problem is that once we start crossing state lines and there's no communication from, you know, Florida to Kentucky, for example, or, you know, from anybody to anybody, it just doesn't happen. So it's so frustrating.
No, it really is. And it's, you know, it's one of those things that it's one of those things that when it comes to the court system, every state gets to do how they want to. And, you know, and I think most of the time it just comes down to where's the money at and where's the budgets and all this other stuff. And, you know, unfortunately, juveniles tend to sometimes get the least amount of care on that side of things. I think on a mental health side of things, juveniles have more opportunities than most adults do in the treatment world. But on this side of things, I think it's very limited in the sense of, like, you know, when you think about DJJ, it's not a very, you know, lucrative business. So they're not trying to put in treatment plans or treatment programs and things like that.
Are there any other questions for Dr. Briggs as we're kind of wrapping this up? We're coming up to the top of the hour here. So, well, Dr. Briggs, thank you very much. Most informative, very interesting topic. Oh, one new message. Hold on. Oh, more thank yous in the chat. Hold on. So there you go. But thank you.
Thank you all.
Fantastic job. So we appreciate it. And if you have any questions about CEUs, like I said, email the Office of Continuing Ed. Otherwise, thank you all for your attendance, and we'll see you in the next event. Yeah, I agree. This was definitely the best one today. These are the people that walked away from the presentation.